And 90 people have joined us. So I'm Shubham, and on behalf of Webtel Electroshock Private Limited, I welcome you all to the second day of our webinar series, Webtel Vigyan Webinar. I would like to introduce the speakers and the moderator of the day. Our speaker for the day of the topic of GST 15 issues faced by taxpayer, CA Tushar Agarwal. Tushar ji has more than 10 years of experience in indirect tax. He has worked with more than 8 years with Lakshmi Kumaran, Sridhatan attorneys. He was also deployed as GST network for GST implementation, has worked closely with government officials. He has worked extensively with the government of India in the designing of GST returns, audit and other formats. Sir's expertise area is GST advisory, compliance and audit. So Tusharji, I welcome you to the webinar. So we're delighted to have you.
Thank you so much, Shubhamji.
The second speaker with us is CA Pitam Goyalji. He's also from Tatvan Advisors. His partner is Tatvan Advisor with Tushar Agarwalji. Along with Tusharji's, Pitamji is also area of expertise in GST advisory, compliance and audit, business valuation, compliance and advisory. He is also a CA, as I already mentioned. Sir has over 10 years of experience of professional in the field of valuation, advisory, compliance, indirect tax, business financing. He's a co-founder of VPTP & Co. and Tatvam Advisors, I already mentioned. So I also invite, I also would like to introduce Pitamji. Welcome, Pitamji, to the webinar.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So the moderator of the day is CA Rajiv Khandelwalji. Already a lot of people must be aware about Sir Webtel Electroshock Private Limited. He has 25 years of experience, indirect taxes, and he is an expert speaker in GST. He's conferred with various awards by ICAI and various branches of ICAI. So again, I would like to welcome Rajiv sir as well. He'll be the moderator for the day. Welcome, Rajiv sir.
Good morning, everybody. I think it is already 11 and we should start the session.
I think it's over to Tushar sir. Without wasting much of time, let's start because the topic is very exciting. I'm looking forward to it, and I'm sure all the participants, around 130 participants, have already joined. Are eager to listen to you, sir. Over to you, sir. Yeah. So I think so. As the topic is very exciting. All the participants along with me are very eager to listen to you, Tusharji. So without wasting much of time, over to Tushar sir.
Thank you, Shubhamji. Rajivji, I think we can start now.
Yeah. So before going to the main topic, and I'm really thankful to the speakers for taking these practical issues, because many a times we have various theoretical issues, but these are very practical issues that they've decided to take in this session, and they've prepared accordingly. And these are the questions that most of you are asking, and we compiled all these questions, and they so I'll just start. So before starting with the other question,
Rajivji, I'm not able to hear you.
And what further you foresee for the future, and also what you think are the opportunities for the various people who are into the professionals, etc., who are into GST. So please give this answer.
Am I audible, Rajivji?
Yeah, you are audible.
Thank you so much, Rajivji. GST has come a long way in a very short span of time. And we all will agree that it has been a roller coaster ride for all of us, whether it's me, you, and all our participants. In last almost 3 years, we have seen more than 350 notifications issued, more than 300 circular, thousands of advance rulings, hundreds of high court judgments, 3 Amendments Act 2018, 19, 20, and the GST law is still developing and evolving. In India, a law is developed not merely by way of act, notification, circulars, but the judgments rendered by High Court, Supreme Court, and other authorities, that is the jurisprudence, also plays a very important role. And in last almost 3 years, we have seen many interesting jurisprudence, like the Gujarat High Court in the case of Mohit Mineral. They held that IGST on ocean freight in case of import on CIF basis is ultra virus. Recently, the Delhi High Court, in case of Pitambram books, held that the restriction imposed by Circular number 125, wherein it was held that you cannot file refund application for multiple tax periods running across different financial years, is not valid under law and is not coming out of law. Then we have seen that on the very similar matter, we have contrary High Court judgments like Trans 1 issue. Punjab and Haryana High Court and Delhi High Court was in favor of taxpayer. Bombay High Court and Allahabad High Court was against the taxpayer. In the context of e-way bill, we had seen that High Court in most of the cases provided relief to the taxpayers by ordering interim release of goods. However, then came the Supreme Court, and which held that CGST law, act, and rules thereunder is a complete court dealing with release of goods. And we now, after that Supreme Court decision, it will be very difficult for all of us to get relief from High Court. Coming to advance rulings, they were always thought to be a dispute mechanism, resolution mechanism. But we all know that the advance rulings have become an host for various interpretational issues. So the GST law is still developing. Even the GST portal is developing. I think Webtel team, being the ASP and GSP, are very well aware how we have witnessed the development of GST portal. So it has been a good and overall nice journey for, I believe personally, for all the professionals, and we all are party to this development of various biggest indirect tax reform in India. Obviously, it is very imperative for all of us to keep updated ourselves with the latest changes, whether in law or in portal, and try to implement it at ground level. Because the law will take some more years to get settled, things will keep on changing, but it's a nice opportunity to be a part of the development of this reform. And to my mind, it's a good opportunity for all the professionals and taxpayers in terms of various kinds of assignments which one can take. Law is not only limited to GST audits or compliances, etc., but even the advisory part is a very important part. How do you structure your business transactions in a more efficient and effective manner so that you are within the four corners of GST law and structuring your transaction in a best manner? So in my mind, it's a law which is a developing law and will take some time to settle. Over to you, Rajiv ji.
Sure, Tushar ji, it's a developing law and we all are also developing. And that is how we've been learning GST and sharing our knowledge with others. So I think it's a very, we all are delighted with all these. Though at some point of time, these changes appear to be very problematic also. But at the same time, we are learning from all these things. And other laws, probably even the youngsters, for them, they were old laws. But even the youngsters who have joined now, they are seeing the journey of how a law evolves. And a law like GST, which is applicable to the entire country, I think it is all the more important. So not wasting much time, I'll start with the question answer session. So first of all, I think the latest topic of discussion at various forums, etc., is the reverse charge on directors' remuneration. I think you'd like to throw some light on that. In the recent case of Rajasthan AAR, where in the case of Clay Crafts India Private Limited, the question has arisen as to whether GST is payable on directors' remuneration under RCM, and also shall there be a different treatment for executive and non-executive directors. And finally, if a company opts to pay tax under RCM, whether it will be required to pay the same retrospectively from 1718 or only from the date of the ruling. That is to which all people will this be applicable, and from the period from which it will be applicable. I request you to answer this question.
Thank you, Rajiv ji. This recent ruling of Rajasthan AAR in the case of Clay Crafts India Private Limited, it's one of the most talked rulings these days. The facts in this ruling was pretty simple. There was a director, whole-time director, and a company. Company was paying salary to the whole-time director. They were also deducting EPF. The director was subject to the terms and policies as applicable to other employees. And in the light of all these background, the AR, without going deep into any discussion and without going much into the reasoning, simply held that the salary which a company is paying to the director, company is liable to pay GST under RCM mechanism on such payment to the director. My humble submission on these rulings. Rajivji, see, in a company, a person is acting in the capacity of a director. So, what is covered under reverse charge is the services provided by the person in the capacity of a director to the company. So, it's the services which a person provides in the capacity of the director to the company is covered under reverse charge mechanism. The very same person can also be an employee of the company. There can be a master and servant relationship between the employee and the employer, that is that particular person and the company. And he gets any salary of an employee, then that should not be covered under reverse charge mechanism. Schedule 3 of the GST Act specifically says that services by employee to employer in the course of employment shall not be treated as employee. So if I'm providing any services in the course of my employment to the company, that is outside the ambit of GST. However, if I'm providing any services in the capacity of a director and not as an employee, then that is covered under reverse charge mechanism. Now let us take an example of a whole-time director. Section 294 states that director in whole-time employee, whole-time director is a director in whole-time employment of the company. So he's a director who is actually in whole-time employment of the company and he's acting as an employee of the company, and the salary which he gets is in the capacity of a director. However, coming to managing director. Now, managing director is a director entrusted with the management of the affairs of the company. Now, this managing director technically may be an employee or may not be an employee. So, only in a situation when he is acting as an employee and he gets salary in the capacity of an employee, then only reverse charge will not be applicable. Director will be said to be acting in a capacity of an employee is an important question for which there are various jurisprudence available. One of the landmark judgment is the Supreme judgment in the case of Nilgiri Cooperative Market Society rendered by the Honorable Supreme Court of India, in which they laid down the criteria and factors to determine employer and employee relationship. Some of the factors are whether he has the right to appoint that employee, the extent of control and supervision, not only in terms of what he has to do, but the way in which he has to do. So there are multiple factors to determine whether there is an employer or employee relationship existing between a director of a company and the director himself and the company himself. So my humble submission on this is, if a director is acting in the capacity of an employee, that is, he's an employee director and he gets salary in the capacity of employee, that will not be covered under reverse charge mechanism. Where he is not acting as an employee, there is no master-servant relationship between the director and the company, and then I pay him certain commission, sitting fees, etc. That will get covered under the ambit of reverse charge mechanism. So the real criteria is not in terms of managing director, executive, non-executive, full-time, etc. We have to see whether that director is acting in the capacity of employee or not. And any payment made in the capacity of employee on which you will deduct TDS under 192 of the Income Tax Act, that amount should not be covered under reverse charge mechanism. So it is very imperative that whenever I make any salary payments to my director and I'm not deducting or not paying reverse charge mechanism on that amount, then I should have sufficient document to substantiate that that director is acting in the capacity of employee. There should be a proper employer and employee agreement entered between the director and the company stating that he is acting as an employee to avoid any disputes in future, because these rulings will create disputes at ground level. To overcome disputes, please have your documentations well drafted. If you are treating any amount paid to the director in the capacity of employee, or deducting TDS under 192, please have proper documents to substantiate that he is an employee of the company acting as an employee. Over to you, Rajiv ji.
So, Tushar, whether these promoter directors will be covered under this or not? Because actually they are the owners only. So in that case, what do you think the remuneration paid to them, and they are full-time directors also? So what is your view in that case?
When you're talking about a full-time director and a full-time director who is in employment of the company, then that whole-time salary paid to those full-time director will not be covered under the reverse charge mechanism. But to avoid any dispute, please have an agreement entered with these directors that they will be working in the capacity of employees also. So in any case, the whole-time definition of whole-time director itself says that it's a director in whole-time employment of the company, so that should not be covered. The real problem will be independent directors, nominee directors, non-executive directors who may not work in the capacity of employees and on which you pay commission and sitting fees to them. That will be covered under reverse charge mechanism.
So I think it will open a Pandora's box, and a lot of issues will be there, litigation will be there, and so it is necessary that we have proper documentation in
Absolutely.
place, right?
Then in fact, now we are practically facing, like we are doing few notices on this in the service tax regime also, same issue came. And the real, see, when we have to challenge something in tribunal, high court, etc., when we have to go to the department and explain, one is the legal understanding and second is the documentation. My documentation with my director should be strong enough to substantiate that he is an employee. I am paying amount to him in the capacity of employee, on which I am deducting TDS under 192 of the Income Tax Act.
Right, right. I think we've spent a lot of time on this. It was important also. So let us move on to the next question. Now, in many cases, we have seen that by mistake or later on the auditor points out, and people pay the RCM after the due date of the payment. Like, so in these cases, whether credit shall be available for transactions pertaining to 18-19 acts on which have been paid under RCM after September 2019. So what is your take on this?
Rajiv, it's a very important question. In fact, many of my team members also come and ask, like they are doing GST audit of 18 and 19, and then they come across a situation where a company has not paid a liability under reverse charge mechanism. Now, if a company is supposed to pay in the month of April, say 2020, this reverse charge liability, can they take credit since September 2019 has passed? For this, I would like to refer section 16.4, which talks about the time limit for taking credit. Section 16.4 says, a registered person shall not be entitled to take input tax credit in respect of any invoice or debit note for supply of goods and services after the due date of furnishing of September month return or filing of annual return, whichever is earlier. So what it says that a taxpayer is not eligible to take credit in respect of any invoice for supply of goods and services. Now, in case of reverse charge mechanism, like before coming to GST regime, we may all recall that under service tax regime, I used to pay reverse charge liability through a challan and used to take credit only through a challan. So challan was the document for taking credit under the service tax regime. Now in GST, I have to take credit only on the basis of a document or an invoice. Challan is not the requisite document for taking credit in case of reverse charge mechanism. It is only the invoice. Now I can have two types of vendors when I'm talking about the reverse charge mechanism. One vendor is someone who is a registered vendor. He is supplying to me and I have to pay the liability in the reverse charge mechanism. So he will issue the invoice. He will write on the invoice that tax is payable under reverse charge mechanism. And second set of vendor is a vendor who is unregistered. So he will never issue a tax invoice. He's simply an unregistered vendor. He issues me a commercial invoice. In this situation, in case I am receiving the supplies from unregistered vendor on which reverse charge is applicable, Section 31(3)(f) specifically says that in this such situations, I have to raise a self-invoice. So, in case I am availing services from an unregistered vendor, a taxpayer is liable to raise a self-invoice, pay tax basis such self-invoice, and take credit on the basis of self-invoice. Now, in this situation, since in 1819, I have not paid the reverse charge on purchases on procurement from unregistered vendors. Today, I come across such a situation that I have to pay reverse charge, say on legal services, GTA services, or import of services. So today will be the time when I will be raising the self-invoice and depositing the tax. In my humble situation, since I am raising the self-invoice now, I should not be hit by the restriction imposed under Section 16(4), and the self-invoice which I am raising now, I should be in a position to take credit till further September 2021. When I'm raising a self-invoice in the month of April 2020, I should be in a position to take credit up to September 2021. That is, and apart from this, one important point to note is what Section 16(4) says is that invoice for supply of goods and services. The word uses invoice for supply of goods and services. And when I talk about self-invoicing, it says that invoice in respect of receipt of goods and services from unregistered supplier. So it talks about receipt and that talk about supply. To my humble submission, self-invoicing cases should not be covered under Section 16(4), and I should be in a position to take credit. But obviously, department at ground level can always dispute. But to my mind, there are good grounds to argue that credit should be available. So in all such situation, my personal opinion is that I should pay my reverse charge liability through GSTR 3B. If I am doing GST audit of 18 and 19, I come across any such situation that RCM has not been paid, and today I want to pay, please pay through 3B, reverse charge liability, take credit in 3B. It's a good case to say that you are not getting hit by Section 16(4) limitation. Over to you, Rajiv ji.
So in this case, you say that an invoice should be self-invoice should be raised in the current date.
Yes, sir. Ultimately, you have not raised earlier.
Yeah.
See, you in 1819, there was a transaction. Say you had made certain payment to the lawyer on which you were supposed to pay under RCM, but
Right.
the accounts team or the tax team at ground level missed that transaction and they had not paid the tax. Since they had not paid the tax, obviously they must have not raised the self-invoice also. Now, you while doing GST audit, you come across such transaction that there is a transaction of payment to legal services on which RCM is not payable. Now you have to pay RCM. So now you can raise a self-invoice, pay RCM, and take credit. Section 16(4) should not be hit by such a situation. In my view, the words used in Section 16(4), I'm again repeating for the sake of clarification, is that it says in respect of invoice for supply. To my mind, where the invoice is issued by the supplier, basis which I take the credit, that invoices are only covered under 16(4), not the documents which are not raised by the supplier, but which I as a taxpayer raised, that is self-invoice, that will not be covered under 16(4). In fact, that's the reason even imports are not covered under 16(4). When I take credit on the basis of bill of entry, etc., that is also not hit by 16(4). Similarly, RCM cases in which I raise a self-invoice, that should not be hit by this 16(4) time limit. So it's a good case. Pay RCM, take credit.
Okay, okay. I think very nicely explained by you, Tusharji. So you were just talking about GST audit also, and the due date has been extended from 31st March to 30th of June. So why don't you also let us know what important points we should keep in mind for GST audit, because now the people will be doing, and probably from home also they are trying to do some of the issues relating GST audit. So please guide us how to complete those GST audits, and what are the important points that should be borne in mind.
Thank you, Rajiv ji. This is a topic which cannot be covered fully in 1 or 2 hours session, but we shall try to cover all the relevant points for undertaking GST audit for the financial year 18-19. Tushar, if you can just take to the next slides if possible. We first of all, we have to understand that for the purpose of doing a GST audit, there are basically two broad parts attached to it. One is the reconciliation statements, and the second part is the legal audit. Under the reconciliation statements, this is further divided into basic three parts. One is the outward details, outward supply details. Second is the inward supply details, and third is the residual, that is the other details. Now, to understand this further, first we need to understand the outward supply details. The table relevant for furnishing details of outward supply details are table number 4, table number 5, table number 10, and table number 11. Now, foremost, before putting any figures in table number 4, 5, 10, 11, an auditor or a company has to do a reconciliation of GSTR1 with 3B with books. The reconciliations between these three, that is GSTR1, 3B, and books, have to be done priorly, and the difference between these three have to be mapped. Just to give an illustration, suppose a company has reported 100 rupees in 3B, and as per books also the transaction reported is 100, but while filing GSTR1 the company has reported only rupees 19. While coming across such difference, when we had discussion with the management, as per management 100 rupees was the correct amount. So GSTR1 declared amount of 90 is not to be considered, as the difference of 10 amount will be shown by the company in the subsequent months. So while filing table number 4 and 5, we have to take total sum of rupees 100. So it is imperative to note that the reconciliations, I am repeating again, reconciliations between 1, 3B and books has to be done beforehand, and the differences of all these transactions need to be mapped out. Now I take a simple example. I to understand the difference between table number 4, 5 and table number 10, 11. Suppose there is a supply of goods of rupees 100 made during the financial year 18-19. Out of rupees 100, company has reported 90 rupees in GSTR 3B for the period 18-19, and 10 rupees company has furnished through the GSTR return 3B in the financial year 19-20. So table number 4, 5 will capture figures of the outward supplies which the company has declared in the financial return, in the 3B returns for the financial year 18-19, and table number 9, 10 and 11 will record the transactions reported in 3B in the FY 2019-20. But these both transactions pertain to financial year 18 and 19. So in this case, 90 rupees we will show in table number 4 and 5, and 10 rupees we will show in table number 10 and 11. Now, the important point for discussion here is, in case of financial year 17-18, there might be the same case. If I take for financial year 17-18, while doing the GST audit for 17-18, if I take the same case of 100 rupees as the total outward supply, 90 rupees was recorded in 3B from the month of July 2017 till 31st of March 2018, and 10 rupees was recorded in 3B in the financial year 18 and 19. So while doing the GST audit in the financial year 17 and 18, 90 rupees would have been shown in table number 4 and 5, and 10 rupees would have been shown in table number 10 and 11. So while conducting the audit for financial year 18 and 19, this 10 rupees will create problem. And in case we want to show this 10 rupees in table number 4 and 5, this will lead to misrepresentation. So representation for the same has already been issued to GST Department Council, and hopefully we will have some clarification over the same. Once we receive the clarification over the same, then we need to appropriately capture the transactions for the financial year 17-18 reported in financial year 18-19 in that particular column. Now, as as Tushar rightly said in the previous question, under RCM, there are the clarifications issued by the department also, that under RCM, the tax which have been paid in the next financial year, that is the transaction for which the RCM was payable in financial year 18-19, but RCM was paid in the financial year 19-20, and input for the same was taken in the financial year 19-20. These type of transaction, even if it pertains to financial year 17-18, need not be reported in GSTR 9 and 9C for the GST audit for the financial year 18 and 19. These have to be shown in financial year 19 and 20 only. To summarize the outward part, the assessee has, just to give, the assessee has paid the tax and reported in financial year 18 and 19. Table number 4 and 5 will be relevant. If assessee has partly paid the tax in financial year 18-19 and partly in 19-20, then partly we have to show in table number 4-5, partly in table number 10-11. If assessee has partly paid the tax in 3B for the financial year 18-19, and if assessee has not paid the taxes till now, in that case we have to show the outward supply details in table number 4 and 5 only, and the difference will arise in table number 9 of 9, and we need to pay the difference amount through form GST DRC 03. Now coming to the second leg, is in respect of the inward supply details. Table number 6-7, table number 8, and table number 12-13 are relevant. As we discussed in outward supply details, same is the case with the inward supply details. Here, it is imperative for the taxpayer and the auditors to have the reconciliations between the GSTR 2A, 3B, and books beforehand, before filing of the informations, and we should map up the differences between the same. So again, in ITC, there are two sets, that is the ITC availed and the ITC reversed. In respect of ITC availed, I am taking an illustration. If suppose company has total ITC available of 100 rupees, through 3B they have taken 90 rupees in their 90 rupees in the 3B in the financial year 18-19, and 10 they have taken in the financial year 19-20. Then we have to show 90 rupees in table number 6 and 10 rupees in table number 12 and 13. Suppose the company was required to reverse the ITC up to an extent of 30 for in the financial year 19 and 20, but the company have reversed only rupees 20 in financial year 18 and 19, sorry, and 10 rupees in 19-20. The company have to show 20 rupees reversal which they made in financial year 18 and 19 in table number 7, and 10 rupees which they reverse in the next financial year they have to show in table number 12 and 13. Now coming to the last point for the inward supply details, that is the table number 8. Now table number 8A and the GST RECO which we usually do for clients have set of differences which have been identified. So it is important for the auditors to make the reconciliation statements for the purpose of table number A, which are quite different from the regular GST RECO which we usually do. Some of the difference or the important difference here are the GST RECO which we do through GSTR 2A is on the basis of auto-populated information from the GSTR 1 data which have been filed, saved or submitted, whereas 8A data is only on the basis of filed GSTR 1. So saved or submitted GSTR 1 is not forming part of table number 8 of form 9. Second important difference here is that the GSTR 8A figures will be auto-populated as on the GSTR 1 filed as on 1st November 2019. So any difference arising after 1st November 2019, we have to map the difference thereon to arrive at correct picture reflecting in table number 8A. Third difference, important difference is GSTR 2A captures the inward supplies where PO point of supplies lies in other states than that of the state of the recipient. whereas the table number 8A does not include the same. So our point here is that while doing the GST audit, it is our duty to make the reconciliations and map it according to the figures reflecting in table number 8A. So these are the major issues which we need to address. Now I request Tushar to take up the legal audit part in the GST audit to be covered.
Thank you, Pritamji, for briefing in just 5 minutes about the entire 99C. I know it's a very tough task, and you rightly explained. It's one part of my GST audit is my outward reconciliation, inward reconciliation, and then my table number 8A versus 2A. Apart from that, it is also imperative as a GST auditor to review the legal transaction from a legal perspective. So in the entire GST law is divided into various chapters. We have a chapter for supplies. There is a concept called supply with consideration. There is a second concept called supply without consideration. Then we have a concept of input tax credit, valuations, place of supply, documentations. So there are various concepts and buckets into which GST law can be divided, and each bucket has various issues. For example, when I talk about ITC, very general issue, whether 180 days payment condition has been complied or not, whether reversal under rule 42 and 43, that is on account of my output being exempted, whether I'm reversing my credit on common inputs, input services, and capital goods. So there are so many transactions and so many scenarios which we have to see. So it is very imperative for a GST auditor to understand the entire business scenarios, business transaction, and business structure of the company, make a checklist of various pointers under GST law, like IT related checklist related to ITC, checklist related to RCM, checklist related to documentations, checklist related to supplies without consideration, etc., and see whether the company is complying with all such legal provisions or not. Obviously, while doing GST audit, like my personal opinion and the way which we have conducted GST audits, there are a company has so many transactions, and it is not possible to ascertain each and every transaction every time. For example, there is a company who's selling 500 different products. Do you mean that you will check the classification of all those 500 products, whether they are classifying it right or wrong? I'm not saying that check each and every product classification, which is not practically can be done. But you have to have certain mechanism to do a proper legal audit apart from mere reconciliation activity. And that mechanism can be build a checklist of all the common issues being faced by all the industries, like 180 days issue, 4243 issue, supplies without consideration issues, supply with related party issues, reverse charge mechanism issues. There are so many issues. So every person should make a checklist, understand broader business transactions, and see if the company is complying with those provisions or not. So legal audit is also very important, and it is imperative that a GST auditor, apart from framing 9 and 9C, while studying the books of accounts, also validate it from a GST point of view. Over to you, Rajiv ji, now.
I think very elaborately explained by both the speakers in a very short period of time. And definitely, I think 9 and 9C require a different session altogether. So we'll try and work out that also. So coming to my next question, in many cases, I've seen that we raise invoices and later on the debtors don't pay. They don't pay or they are unable to pay, and we have to write these bad debts, write off these bad debts. And or sometimes there is a revision in the price. The base price may be lowered because of various reasons, or sometimes the service may be partly provided. So in all these cases, what is the implication of refund or adjustment of tax paid under GST in these situations? Even in our company, we face these kind of issues, and I think everybody faces as auditors. Also, you find for your clients, and if the people from companies are there, they must also be facing these issues. That whether refund or adjustment of taxes already paid, but later on the debts have been becoming bad. So, what is to be done in these cases?
That's a very live issue which I think everyone is facing. Now, due to this COVID-19, I'm sure that every taxpayer will undergo situations like this, that is cancellation of contracts, price negotiation, bad debts, etc. So what should be the GST treatment in all these scenarios? For this, the two relevant sections for us is section 34, which talks about credit note, and section 54, which talks about refund. So as far as credit note is concerned, you can issue credit note only in certain circumstances. First circumstance, where you have issued the invoice with a taxable value which exceeds the actual value. Second, when the goods are returned by the customer. Third, when goods or services are found to be deficient. So, and the recently, the board has also come out with a circular 2 days back giving various clarity on the issuance of credit note and refund mechanism in case of cancellation and price negotiation. So in short, in case of cancellation of services of price revision, downward price revision, we can follow section 34 and issue credit note to the customer, but issuance of credit note has a timeline. So in case of cancellation of service contracts or price revision, I can issue a credit note to the customer, but issuance of credit note has a timeline. The timeline is same as what we discussed under section 16.4 for availing inputs credit. That is, in respect of invoice which is issued in the year 1920, I can raise credit note only up to September 2020. So luckily we are in April 2020, and we will definitely find so much of price revision and cancellations in respect of invoices which are already issued in 1920. So we have the time to issue credit note with regard to such transactions. However, in case of bad debts, the concept is totally different. In bad debt, it is not the case of deficient provisioning of services or cancellation of services. You have provided the services, but he is not making payment to you. That scenario is not covered under section 34. Even you cannot go for refund stating that this is not a supply itself. Under GST law, the taxable event is supply for a consideration. So in this case is also there is a supply, there is a consideration also, but you have not received that consideration. Non-receipt of consideration is different from absence of consideration. So in this, there is a consideration, there is a supply, so the taxable event triggers. So to my mind, there is no way to take GST adjustments in case of bad debts. The GST paid is already a loss. In fact, we are representing this issue through some associations that since next year there will be so many scenarios of bad debts, etc., the government should come out with a relief of GST adjustment even in case of bad debts. However, in case of cancellation of service contracts and price revision, etc., I can go for credit note, but credit note has to be issued within the time limit. And even if that time limit has passed, then there is an alternate option of refunds. But refund also have a time limit of 2 years from the relevant date. So depending upon each case, this what I explained is a very, very general concept, and exact implications will be dependent upon the facts of each case when there will be a live issue in hand. Over to you, Rajiv.
Okay. So in bad debts, we'll be facing some problems. But other than that, if there are some other issues or the material supplied is less or services are not fully provided, in that case, probably we can get a credit, and proper time limit should be followed in that case also, right?
Absolutely, Rajiv ji.
Okay. So the next issue, another burning topic, a lot of people have a problem with that also. Rule 36(4), wherein only what is appearing in our 2A is there, and another 10% is allowed. So people were facing a lot of problems with that. And now in this COVID-19 situation, the government has relaxed that rule, and it has said that from February to August, you can claim whatever is appearing in your own books of account, the eligible credit. but when we file for the month of September, and cumulatively for all these months, we have to do the matching with 2A, and whatever is available, we will get the benefit plus 10%, less whatever we have already taken the credit of. So that seems good, and people think it's very good. But I think there are problems with that also. First, the reconciliation will be deferred, and after 6-7 months, it will be more difficult for us to reconcile. Then secondly, I think some interest implications will also come if we pay late on these things. So why don't you throw some light on that?
Thank you, Rajiv ji. As you told, as you said, Rule 36.4 is the most discussed topic on various platforms across India and corporates, as this rule restricts ITC available to the taxpayer. As per section 36.4, ITC to the registered person shall be available only to an extent of invoices and debit notes uploaded by the supplier on the portal. And also a provisional amount shall be allowed, not more than 10% of the eligible credit. That is the credit which has been uploaded by the supplier. So if I divide into the eligible credit under section 36.4, there are two types of credit. One is the credit uploaded by the supplier, that is the eligible credit, plus 10% over and above the total amount or the credit which have been uploaded by the supplier. Rule 36.4 was applicable from 9th October 2019. Provisional credit from 9th October 2019 till 31st of December 2019 was available to the registered person at a rate of 20% over the eligible credit. But from 1st of January, the amount provisional credit percentage has been reduced from 20 to 10%. It is here imperative to note that 36 provisions, 36.4 rule 36.4 provisions has to be done by every registered person on monthly basis, and the responsibility of doing these monthly recos and reflecting in your 3B is the responsibility for the registered person, and they have to satisfy the jurisdictional officer in this regard. Now, just to understand this, let's take an illustration. For example, your ITC in the books of account is available. This is on your screen. This is visible. The ITC available on your books of account. Suppose it is 1,50,000. In that, the 5,000 is in respect of RCM import of ISD credits, and 5,000 is in respect of the credit availed for supplies received before October 2019. So RCM import and ISD does not comes into GSTR 2A, as well as the credit availed for supplies received before October 2019. I am reducing as this does not form part of my ITC for the current month. So the eligible credit which needs to be compared for Rule 34 is 1,40,000. If I assume that in the month of October, I have a eligible credit of 85,000 in my 2A, and in that 85,000, suppose there is an ineligible credit of 5,000 rupees, and the credit which actually was uploaded in my 2A in the previous months, but have been booked in my books during the current month, need to be added back. And also the credit for the earlier months which have been availed in earlier 3B need to be added. So if I go into the net figure, so ITC available in respect of 2A plus credit note was 75,000. If I add a provisional credit of 20%, 15,000, total ITC available was 90,000. And as per rule, as per the ITC, as per books was 1,40,000. So there will be a credit cash flow loss for 50,000, which shall be available to me on a later stage. So, to the current pandemic of the coronavirus, the notifications has been issued, which states that from the month of February 2020 till August 2020 returns, registered person need not comply with Rule 36.4. It means that they can take input as per their books data without carrying out GSTR RECO for the set period. As per the notification, while filing GSTR 3B for the months of September 2020, we have to do a cumulative ITC calculation with respect of invoice and debit notes uploaded by the supplier. It is very important. Rule 36.4 has not been waived. It is just that the reconciliation of the input has to be carried out cumulatively for 8 months from February 2020 till September 2020 and have to be reported in September 2020 returns. Now the important question here is, when we take the adjustment of the 36.4 in our September 2020 returns, whether we need to make the interest payment over the same or not. Just to illustrate it, let's suppose I have availed an ITC of 100 rupees from February 2020 till September 2020, and while in the month of September, after I had a two-way RECO with my books and eligible credit, along with adding the provisional credit, total credit available to me was 90 rupees. So I need to reverse to an extent of 10 rupees of ITC. So while reversing 10 rupees of ITC in September 2020, whether he shall be liable to pay interest over the said amount or not, as per our understanding and opinion, as the trigger point for reversal of ITC pertaining to February till September was in the month of September 2020 only. Hence, interest should not be paid over the excess ITC availed, that is rupees 10. Due to this pandemic, deferment of provisions for Rule 36.4 should be read in relation to interest to be charged under Section 50. However, if the registered person reverses the said amount in October 2020 or thereafter, there shall be liability of the interest over the said reversal. Over to you, Rajiv ji. Rajiv ji.
Are we audible?
Yeah.
Yes.
So the next question would be, in many cases we are facing issues regarding cross charge and input service distribution. So can you explain the difference between the two, and whether cross charge is required even during this current period when the entire business operations are at halt?
Certainly, Rajiv ji. So cross charge has been one of the most hot topics since implementation of GST. So let us firstly understand what is cross charge. What do you mean by cross charge? Legally, there is no term called cross charge in the GST Act. See, I am a legal entity. I have various offices. I have multiple plants, say in Gujarat, Maharashtra, Chhattisgarh, and my head office is in Haryana. The employee sitting in the head office undertakes various activities for my plant related to administrations, IT, legal, etc., etc. So before GST, there was no concept of services between my branches of the same legal entity. It was my legal employees. The employees were of the legal entity, and if the employee was performing any activity sitting in Haryana branch, it never meant that Haryana branch is providing any services to my Maharashtra factory, Gujarat factory, etc. But in GST regime, the concept has entirely changed. Now in GST, every registration of a legal entity is treated as distinct person. Every registration of a legal entity. So if I have a registration in Haryana, if I have a registration in Gujarat and Maharashtra, then all these registrations will be treated as distinct persons. And under Schedule 1, supplies between this distinct person is taxable. That's why the stock transfer is taxable. If I stock transfer from my one branch, having one registration to another branch, having another registration. So in the context of goods, it is relatively easy to identify the transaction. The real challenge comes in case my head office, which is in Haryana. What is the role of my head office? My role of head office is to provide business support and consultancy to my plants in Maharashtra and Gujarat. So there is a provision of support services by my head office to my plants in Gujarat and Maharashtra. Since these are treated as distinct person under GST law and supply of goods and services between distinct person is taxable, so this provision of service by head office to my plants will be taxable and GST has to be paid on such transaction. The next issue arises how to identify the value of such transaction that the head office is providing, that the support services which head office is providing to my plants. There cannot be any open market value or comparative value. So in my mind, the best mechanism is to opt for two rules. First is proviso to Rule 28, which says that if full credit is available to my recipient, then the value charged on the invoice will be treated as the transaction value. So if my recipient is getting full credit, then in such a situation, valuation will not be a major concern. Any reasonable value on the invoice will be valid invoice, valid value, and valid transaction value as per the proviso to Rule 28. However, if my recipient is not getting full credit, if my recipient is engaged in, say, supply of certain exempted product, etc., and full credit is not available, then at least my value should be the cost of my services. And the cost of my services is the cost which I am incurring at my head office location for providing that service. So this is basically is a concept of provision of services by head office to plants. Similarly, we can have a concept of cross charge in case I have a marketing office which is providing marketing support to my plants. So there can be a provision from marketing office to my plant. So what I have to do as a consultant and taxpayer is to identify all my locations, check the roles and responsibilities of all my locations, see if my location is directly linked to the end customer. If not, whether my location is providing support to another location. If yes, the support provided by one location to another location, each having different registration, is covered under the ambit of GST. Now, comparing to ISG, there is a slight difference between cross charge and ISG. Cross charge is a supply of service from one office to another office of the same legal entity, whereas ISG is only a distribution of credit on the invoices available. For example, many times what happens that the services are availed directly by the plants, but for the purpose of processing of invoice, the invoice comes to the head office. Head office signs and clears the invoice. It is only processing the invoice. The services are actually availed directly by the plant. In such situation, when head office act as only an invoice clearing agency and processing of invoice is the activity which is undertaken by head office, then in such a situation, this credit has to be distributed through ISG mechanism to the respective plants. So ISG will be, situations will be covered in ISG in cases where head office or the office is having the limited role of processing the invoice, whereas cross charge is altogether a different concept. It is for the supply of services by my head office to my recipient office. So in fact, this ISG versus cross charge is a very big concept. And to my mind, I think we cannot explain in entirety in today's session itself, considering there can be various issues, various disputes. So maybe what we will do, Rajiv ji, we will have another day, a separate session on this itself, where we'll take the entire trial balance, various kinds of expenditure which are there in the trial balance, and check which has to be routed through ISG, which has to be routed through cross charge. And before concluding, one important point, the examples which I took was comparatively very easy examples. Depending upon industry to industry, the concept of cross charge can vary. Take an example of an airline industry. They purchase, say, aircraft, or they take aircraft on operating on financial lease on one registration, say Gurgaon registration. But this aircraft is used across India by all the registrations of airlines for providing transportation services. So in this also, there is a provision of supply of aircraft from my Gurgaon branch to all the branches, so that my respective branch can undertake transportation of passenger services using the same aircraft. So even in telecom, the situation can differ. In banks, the situation can differ. So we have to identify and understand the entire business transaction, business structure, and role of each and every office to identify where I have to do cross charge, on what value I have to cross charge. So it's a very important role, and it is imperative for me to consider and implement this in my GST audits also, because we have seen many companies are not implementing cross charge, whereas it is a very important concept, and even the department and audit checklist has included this concept. Over to you, Rajiv ji.
I think very well explained in the limited time frame. And so you think that even in the cases of GST audit, we should be reporting if proper cross charge is not there?
To my mind, see, cross charge is a topic which has been discussed in various platforms. Multiple representations have been given, and there is a kind of certainty in terms of that a entity has to implement cross charge. So as a GST auditor, I will advise that let me not take that risk of not reporting this. I should report this in my audit report, etc. Make an observation on this, because this is no, I cannot escape by saying that it was a pure interpretational issue. Different experts are having different opinions, so let's avoid this. to my mind as a GST auditor, I cannot leave this cross charge point. I may play with value, but I cannot leave this cross charge point. I have to implement this.
Okay, point well taken. Besides that, I think another issue which is related to the audit is that there are transactions with related parties also. And what all points should we keep in mind regarding related party transactions? And could you give us some examples of what all transactions can exist between related parties and how to report them in GST audit, or otherwise what caution should be taken in because always the department is after such related party transactions, and also sometimes people also use them as sham transactions. So what is your take on that?
Absolutely, Rajiv. This is one of the most important area to look into. So under Schedule 1, supplies of goods and services between related parties, even without consideration, is taxable. There are two parts to related party transaction. One is supply of goods and services to related parties for a consideration, and second is supply of goods and services for my related party without consideration. In both scenarios, I have to be very careful. So there are lots of transactions which is without any consideration, and still it is within the ambit of GST law, and which I have to pay GST on it. And I have seen personally many people, like whenever I go discuss with them, whether as a part of as a GST auditor or as a their legal consultant, I come across in most of the scenarios that such transaction which is without consideration, there are multiple transactions involved in a business, they generally don't pay GST. Similarly, when we talk about with consideration, then valuation will be an important role. Even it's a with consideration, but there is a tax liability attached to it, but valuation is an important aspect. So what we will do is we will take certain examples which we generally find in day-to-day routine. What are the examples which are generally covered when we talk about transactions with related party? And please note that related party definition is wide enough to include many, many companies. I'm not getting much into what is related party, who is a related party. The definition is very wide, but at a broader level, it will cover my joint ventures, my subsidiaries, my employees also. So I will ask Peter to explain some of the examples which we generally find in our day-to-day activity.
Thank you, Tushar. As you rightly pointed out, we need to understand the related party transactions. Related party transactions can be divided into two main buckets. One of which are apparent from the financials of the company, and other which are not apparent from the financials of the company. पहला bucket वो जो मैं financial से देख के identify कर सकता हूँ. Second bucket वो जो मैं financials अगर देखता हूँ तो उससे भी मुझे दिखाई नहीं देती transactions. इसको समझने के लिए let us discuss few illustrations. First illustration, for example, there is a group of companies, let's say 10 companies are there, which are running under same control and management. They all have their registered office in Haryana, and the office premises is being owned by a parent company of the group. Employees of the parent company is also taking care of the administrative and the compliance work of all other 9 group companies. So as per Schedule 1 of the CGST Act, this transaction qualifies as supply without consideration between the related party, and tax needs to be paid by the parent company for rendering services in the form of management consultation services to it other group companies. At what value they will pay, that we will discuss later. Second example, just to add on to it, is for corporate guarantees. Parent companies generally provide corporate guarantee in favor of banks so as to enable their subsidiaries or the group companies to avail debt from the financial institutions or the banks. Whether furnishing of these corporate guarantees in favor of banks for debt availed by subsidiaries company would qualify as supply and tax need to be paid. In our opinion, yes, this qualifies as a transactions between the related party and tax need to be paid over the same. Now let us go into one more example, third example. For example, my group, there are total 10 companies, and each company is into selling of goods or providing services to the customers under same trade name. 10 companies हैं, 10 की 10 कोई किसी प्रोडक्ट में सेल का काम करती है, कोई किसी प्रोडक्ट की लाइन ऑफ एक्शन है, या फिर अलग अलग सर्विसेज प्रोवाइड करती हैं. All 10 companies are running their business under the common trade name. Such trade name is being registered in the name of parent company. Can't in this case we say that the parent company is providing services to the other group companies in the form of usage of its trade names? Yes. Now we have understood as per the above examples that there are many transactions which are visible or which may not be visible from the financials of the company are deemed as supply under schedule 1 and tax need to be paid over the same. Now we need to understand at what value the parent company need to pay GST. As explained by Tushar, for understanding the value of GST, we need to see the rule 28 to 30. Important point for consideration here is that the second provision to rule 28 states that if the recipient of the goods or services is eligible for the full input tax credit, then the invoice value declared in the invoices will be deemed to be open market value. Just to add on for a half a minute, in our earlier example, if we say that out of 10 companies who were trading under the common trade name, one of the companies was providing the exempted goods or supplying the exempted services, then for the purpose of valuation, it is prominent that the supplier cannot take the benefit of second proviso to rule 28. He need to pay tax which is equivalent to the open market value. As far as our experience is concerned with respect of department GST audit, jurisdictional officers are looking into these transactions deeply and need to be addressed. Over to you, Rajiv ji. Hello.
So that was properly explained. Now let take me to the next question.
So Rajiv ji, what we will do is now considering the time limit. See, hardly 25 minutes are left. We will, and there are more 7-8 questions left. So we will not invest much time, and we will try to finish all the 15 questions for our participants and audience. We will be a little faster.
Sure. So there are also various changes in export provisions, and considering the same, would it be a better option for the taxpayer to go for export with payment practice or without payment? So what is your take on that?
There cannot be any blanket answer to this, that whether a taxpayer should opt for export on payment of duty or without payment of duty. There are various pros and cons under each of the model, and there are various factors. To illustrate, in case you opt for export without payment of duty under LUT, you cannot claim refund of your capital goods credit. And if you have a good amount of capital goods credit, then the only option left with you is to export on payment of duty. Similarly, because of recent amendments, now in case of export on payment of duty, you additionally need to satisfy the condition of receipt of foreign currency in respect of export of goods on payment of duty. So there are actually multiple factors involved in deciding whether I have to export on payment of duty or without payment of duty. First is my cash flow factor. Second is my receipt of foreign currency factor. Third is my capital goods credit, which is eligible. Fourth is my Rule 36 for computation, which is applicable in one that is without payment of duty and not on payment of duty. So there are various factors, and depending upon fact of each case, I have to determine whether I have to export on payment of duty or without payment of duty. There cannot be a blanket answer to this. And it is also important to note that for different transactions, I can opt different mechanisms. Like for term transactions, I may opt for export on payment of duty, and for some transactions, I may opt for payment without or export without payment of duty. But depending upon the facts of each case, we have to answer this. This is very general and question and cannot be answered straightforward. Okay. Over to you, Rajiv ji.
Okay, I think a related question was one of the participants was asking whether LUT for 1920 will continue for 2021 also. I think that it has been extended to 30th of June. 30th of June, you can apply for the LUT for the next year. In the meantime, you can continue using the earlier one. I think that's the case.
Perfect, Rajiv ji. You are the authority, right?
Okay, so the next question would be, in many cases we see companies are required to now, because of this pandemic, most of the companies will be required to impair their assets amidst this epidemic. So whether companies will be required to reverse the credit to the extent of assets written off in accordance with section 17 subsection 5.
Interesting issue, Rajiv ji. Now, because of this COVID-19 issues, many people will undertake impairment of assets, revaluation, etc. in their accounting books. So what will be the impact of the same from the perspective of GST? Whether I required to reverse my credit, because section 17.5 specifically says that I need to reverse credit in case my goods are written off. So if I'm writing off on account of impairment and revaluation, am I required to reverse credit? So before understanding this concept of reversal, let us firstly understand the concept of impairment and revaluation of inventories in Ind AS. I will ask Preetham to explain us this concept because he has a good experience in Ind AS implementations, and then we will answer whether 17.5X will be triggered or not.
Thank you, Tushar. With respect to the said topic, we need to understand two concepts. One is the impairment, and second is the change in the value of inventory. With respect to impairment of assets, as per Ind AS 36, objective is to ensure that the carrying value, that is the value at which the assets shall be recorded in the books of accounts at the reporting period, does not exceed the recoverable value. Now, to understand the change in the inventory value as per Ind AS 2, due to this pandemic, we need to mandatorily check while closing our financials whether goods or the inventory has not become obsolete, or near to the expiry terms, or due to any other reasons their net realizable value has drastically decreased. So as per Ind AS 2, inventory has to be recorded at a lower of cost purchase cost, or the net realizable value, whichever is lower. Under both the provisions, it is imperative to understand that the company has only reduced the carrying amount of assets and inventory on the reporting date. These assets still form part of the fixed asset register, and the quantity for both, that is the assets and the inventory, remains intact. That remains therein. Now over to you, Tushar, for the legal implication.
So what Preetham you explained is that my inventory is intact, my asset is intact. I'm just revaluing it, only decreasing the value of the same. Now section 17.5 says that if goods are lost, stolen, destroyed, written off, or disposed of by way of gifts or samples. So in case of lost, it is completely lost. In case of stolen, it is goes away from my possession. Similarly, in case of gift, samples, these are all the scenarios in which I lose my goods. I lose the possession of my goods totally. Now the word written off is used in the company of the words lost, stolen, destroyed, disposed of by way of gift, etc. There is a rule of construction, nocere sources. It means that the meaning of a word should be determined by considering the words with which it is associated in this context. In my opinion and a humble submission, the word written off should be read along with the words lost, stolen, destroyed, and only in a scenario when I'm writing off goods because of the fact that these goods are no more with me. I cannot use these goods. They are completely destroyed or stolen. And I'm writing off for a reason that I'm not in a position to use the goods anymore. Then only reversal will be triggered. In case of revaluation or impairment, etc., then I'm having the possession of goods, then I can use these goods for my business purpose, and I'm just doing revaluation or impairment in terms of accounting principles. That should not be a determinative factor for reversal of credit. So in my humble submission, no reversal required. Over to you, Rajiv ji.
I think point well taken. Now let me, why don't you answer one of my own personal questions? We as a software provider, Webtel gets various pamphlets, brochures printed, etc., and distribute to our prospective customers at various seminars, various events, etc. So do you think whether any reversal of ITC is required in such cases?
A very important question, Rajiv ji, and it is being asked by companies time and again. And the confusion is because of Section 17(5) itself, which says that credit should not be available for goods lost, stolen, destroyed, written over, disposed of by way of gifts, etc. So when distributing my price list, brochures, etc., this is an expenditure which I am incurring in the course of my business. Section 16 of the GST Act says that I am eligible for credit of any goods and services which I am using in the course of my business, and there is no doubt that such distribution of pamphlet, price lists, brochures, etc. is definitely in the course of my business. Only issue arises is whether I'm covered under Section 17(5)(h), which says that can I say these goods are disposed of by way of gifts. To my mind, gift is something of voluntary payment given by one person to another person without any consideration, and which has certain economic value for the recipient. So if you give, say, your distributor free phones, free gold coins, that is called a gift, which has certain economic value to the recipient. When you distribute your own pamphlet, your brochure, your price list, these does not have any economic value to the recipient. No personal economic value can be attached vis-a-vis the recipient. And to my mind, this will not be covered under dispose of by way of gift, etc. So it is in the course of business expenditure. This expenditure is in the course of business only. In Schedule 1, which talks about permanent transfer or disposal of business assets. To my mind, it's basically the expenditure which you have incurred. It's not the business asset. This will be reported as an expenditure. My printing and stationery expenditure, business advertisement expenditure. So all these distribution of brochures, price lists, catalogs, etc., credit will be fully eligible and it will not be covered under the negative list under Section 17(5) of the GST Act. Over to you, Rajiv ji.
Okay, so good that we can take credit, otherwise it's a problem. So the next question would be whether interest on delayed payment under Section 50 of the CGST Act will be calculated on the gross liability basis or on a liability basis.
So Rajiv ji, as per Section 50, every person who is liable to pay tax but fails to pay the tax to the government within the period prescribed therein shall be liable to pay an interest at the rate of 18% for the delay period. Suppose a registered person outwards liability for the month of March 2020 was rupees 100. Out of 100, he has an eligible ITC of 60 or 40 need to be paid through cash ledgers. Whether interest needs to be paid on 40 or rupees 100. Over the same issues, different orders have been passed by different high courts as per the internal memo issued by the GST. Jurisdictional officers have issued notice to various registered persons for payment of interest as per the gross liability. In the recent 39th GST Council meeting, the issue was discussed and it was held that interest on the delayed payment was to be charged only on the cash component from retrospective basis. However, government is yet to issue a notification in this regard. Hopefully, we will have a notification in this regards to settle our issues. Over to you, Rajiv ji.
Okay. The next question would be, as per notification 13/2017 central tax rate, whether services provided by government to business entity shall attract reverse charge, and if yes, what all government payments are covered under this entry?
It's a very important question, and to my mind, it in fact requires multiple hours to discuss this. But I will brief just in 2-3 minutes the principles which we have to keep in mind. Reverse charge is applicable only on services provided by government and local authority to the business entity. So, under GST law, there are 4 kinds of entities. First is government. Government means central government, state government, etc. Second is local authority. Third is governmental authority. Fourth is government entity. So it is very imperative for us to know that there is a difference between government, local authority, governmental authority, and government entity. And we always get confused. And there is a lots of jurisprudence available on this. So only in the case my supplier is a government and local authority, then only reverse charge will be triggered. If my supplier of services is a governmental authority and government entity, reverse charge will not be applicable. So first step is to determine the nature of my supplier, whether government, local authority, common entity. Only in case of government and local authority, reverse charge is applicable. Second step is to determine the payment which I am making to the local authority or the government, whether it's a consideration for any supply which I am receiving, whether the payment which I'm making to them and the services they are providing to me. If there is a quid pro quo relationship between the supply and the consideration, if the answer to that is yes, then only reverse charge will be triggered. Even if the answer to that is yes, I have to look into whether there are any exemptions available or not. There are few of the exemptions available under GST law, like services by way of registration under any law, services in the form of testing, safe checks, certifications, cases where the consideration is less than 500,000 rupees. Again, an exemption is available. Exemption is available in respect of liquidated damages, etc. So, if my supplier is government, local authority, and not governmental authority and government entity, first condition. Second, there should be a quid pro quo between the services rental by the government or local authority and the consideration which I am making to them. Third, it should not be covered under any of the exemption notification. Only such a situation, reverse charge will be applicable. To illustrate, allocation of spectrum. This allocation was spectrum for a licensing and spectrum fees. They give me a permission to operate this telecommunication business for which I'm making them licensing fees or spectrum fees. So there is a quid pro, government is providing me this license of giving spectrum. There is a quid pro quo because they are giving me permission for which I'm giving them certain money and it is not covered under any exemption. Hence, reverse charge will be applicable. Similarly, reverse charge will be applicable on royalty fees, etc. In this manner, we have to determine the taxability of various kinds of payment which I make. Drug approval charges, ROC fees, payments under FTAP, explosive license fees. For operating restaurants, we have to pay various kinds of payment to the government. So there are lots of payment which we are making to the government. The principles is what we have discussed. This is what we have to keep in mind to ascertain whether reverse charge is applicable or not. Over to you, Rajiv ji.
Another burning issue which most of us face is that we provide concessional goods at concessional rates to our employees, or probably even food to them, or transport at concessional rates. So what do you think are the GST implications of the same?
Okay, Rajiv ji. So as discussed earlier, employee and employer are related parties, and as per Schedule 3, service rendered by an employee to an employer in the course of employment are not treated supply. Now, employee recovery can be in the form of canteen services, mobile, or car lease. Just to give illustration, suppose an employer is providing canteen service to its employer, for which employer is charging a concessional rate of rupees 50 per meal, and backly the employer has hired a contractor for providing the canteen services and he is paying rupees 100 per meal. So whether the employer is providing any services to the employee, yes, the employer is providing services to the employees, and this is not covered under Schedule 3. Schedule 3 only covers a situation where employee has provided services to the employer in the course of employment. Now the question here arises, on what value employer has to pay tax, whether 100 or 50. As discussed earlier, as employer and employee are related party, and as per Rule 28, valuation need to be done on the basis of open market value. Hence, tax need to be paid at a rate of 100, as the 100 is the open market value. Let's take another example. Suppose an employer has given a mobile connection to his employees with a condition that the employer shall bear a mobile expense up to rupees month. In case of a mobile bill coming to rupees 1500, 500 recovered from employee by an employer would be liable to GST or not? The answer here would be yes, as this again being the supply made by an employer to an employee, which is nowhere exempted. Now, one more major issues in employee recoveries is in the form of notice pay recoveries. notice pay recovery is different from other sort of recoveries which we have discussed, as the notice pay recovery is in the form of damages or penalties. Issues regarding the notice pay recovery we shall discuss subsequently in our next slides. Over to you, Rajiv ji.
Yeah, just as you were talking about penalties, etc. In contracts, there are provisions regarding if there are delays, liquidated damages, etc. have to be paid. So, what is the taxability of liquidated damages or the forfeiture of amount under GST, and whether it shall be treated as an toleration of an act?
Sir, there is actually no clear jurisprudence on this. Schedule 2 specifically includes agreeing to the obligation to refrain from an act or to tolerate an act or to do an act. So the department is of the view, say, let us take an example. If as a contractor I have delayed the construction and you are charging liquidated damages from me, then department says that you have tolerated my act of delay of construction from my end, and hence you are recovering liquidated damages from me, and hence you are making a supply which is covered under Schedule 2. To my mind, this is one set of coin which is available, that he is tolerating my act of not completing the construction on time. Another school of thought and to view this transaction is, in fact, he is not tolerating my act of not completing the construction on time. He is not tolerating. That's why he is imposing a damage, liquidated damage and penalty on me, and telling me that please complete the construction on time. I'm not tolerating this act of non completion of construction on time, and hence imposing a damage or a penalty. So to my mind, this entry of Schedule 2 where it says I'm tolerating an act should be a positive act, a section which is a positive section, a positive act by the supplier, and not be a negative act. So in my personal opinion, there is a good case to say that rather I am not tolerating all these activities, hence charging the damage and penalty, and the amount which I am receiving is in nature of damage and penalty, not liable to tax. But department is of the view that I am tolerating your act and getting a consideration in form of damage. There are various jurisprudence available on this in India as well as foreign. In foreign, you have various rulings in Australia and Europe, etc., on the very same subject, even in New Zealand, etc. Similarly, in India, we have so many latest notice judgments which have come up, even in the context of notice pay. Madras High Court, in the case of G&T, held that no GST is payable on notice pay, no service tax is payable on notice pay, referring to section 66E. Even in HCL, tribunal held that no service tax is payable. So multiple judgments are coming, but department has issued few FAQ stating that liquidated damages, etc., everything is chargeable to tax. To my mind, to conclude, the taxability of LD is not yet settled, and it will be settled at higher forum. You will find multiple cases in India as well as foreign. Even in foreign jurisprudence, there is no certainty. So if I have to save tax, please structure your contract clauses in such a manner that the amount which you charge is in the nature of penalty and damage to compensate you, and not in the nature of consideration. So the wordings of the contract should be very important, and it should be structured in a manner that it shows that the amount which is charged is actually in the nature of damage and penalty. Over to you. And with regard to notice pay, sir, in my humble opinion, multiple judgments have come, and it's a very good case to argue that no tax should be payable on notice pay. No GST is not payable on notice pay. Multiple foreign and Indian jurisprudence are available on this. But again, department at ground level will contest. So I have to take a commercial call. Many companies where the value is less, they are paying GST, and big companies, big like Infosys, TCS, etc., we had discussion with them. We have taken a big stand because the accretion rate is much there and the value of notice pay is very high. So they are fighting this case. But to my humble submission, very good case to argue in case of notice pay. Over to you, sir.
That brings us to the last question from my side. Thereafter, we'll be taking question and answer questions from the participants. They've already a lot of questions on the chat. So now the financial year 1920 has come to an end in spite of all these close down. In fact, not only the financial year, everything has also come to a closure. So what all precautions are required to be undertaken by the company by closing its books of accounts? Your take on that?
Yes, Rajiv ji. So in respect, there are many issues which need to be addressed for the compliance to be done in the month of March. March being the last month for the financial or the reporting period, company and an auditor or a consultant need to look into many aspects which are of a prominent or important, utmost importance. First is the unique invoice numbering, which need to be start for the next financial year. So as per rule 46, the registered person can start the unique series from initially from 1, or they can continue the previous series which they were following during the last financial year. The second point is the letter of undertaking. The letter of undertaking need to be applied for the purpose of taking the benefits of export without the payment of duty. But as per the notification number 35/2020, the date for applying LUT under RFD 11 has been extended till 30th June 2020. The cross charge, as explained by Tushar, need to be finalized and billing for the same has to be done. The reconciliations part need to be matched between 1, 3B and books, and gaps in any need to be identified and recorded in our books. Common credit, rule 42, 43 reversals need to be made, which we were doing on monthly basis. We have to check on a yearly basis and have to take an impact for 42, 43 reversals so as to so that interest is not applicable. RCM need to be checked whether there is any provisions for under which we need to make an RCM. For example, in real estate industries and real estate, if they are adopting a benefit under reduced rates, have to minimum pay, have to procure 80% of the goods or the services from a registered person. If they have not procured the 80% of the goods or the services, they have to pay an RCM at the rate of 18% for the shortfall. Rule 37 need to be complied with, whether we at the closing reporting period, whether there are instances for which the payment have not been made to the suppliers and that it has been exceeded by 180 days. So competition dealers need to check whether they want to opt for competition dealers in the competition scheme or not. There are also other compliances or other reconciliations which need to be mapped. For examples, they need to we need to reconcile the ledger of advance so as to arrive at the unadjusted advance outstanding at the end of the financial year or the last reporting period. We need to check the inventories. In case the inventories are short in the physical count, we need to reverse the ITC. We need to check the goods sent on approval, whether the goods sent on approval have exceeded their time limits or not. We need to check all the other GST returns previously so that the corrections can be taken care in the month of March. So these are the broad parameters which need to be addressed before closing. Over to you, Rajiv ji.
Rajiv ji, it's 12:30. We completed on time.